Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here this afternoon. My name is Jessica Davis. I am the Public Information Officer here for the 26th Judicial District in Mecklenburg County, Charlotte, North Carolina. Want to welcome you all to this session this afternoon, but I also want to welcome you all to Charlotte, North Carolina. Even though we don't have our Carolina blue skies at the moment, please know that the weather is cooperating, that it is 60 degrees in February. Welcome to this afternoon's session, What We've Learned from Building School Justice Partnerships. I am thrilled to be here this afternoon with two very phenomenal women to lead today's session. We will have Teri Deal, who is the Principal Court Management Consultant for the National Center for State Courts, as well as Ms. Marsha Landers, who is an Assistant Administrator for the Allegheny County Juvenile Court system. So without further ado, I would like to welcome them and also let you all know there will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so hold your questions as long as you can. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Good afternoon, everybody. We're so excited that you chose to spend some time with us so we can tell you what we've learned about working with schools. I want to get started by just asking you a question. What are some things, in your opinion, that schools and courts have in common? Any thoughts? Kids, right? We both serve kids. Anything else come to mind? Right? We're related in that way. Schools refer kids to us. And another thing that I've noticed is that both juvenile courts and schools are increasingly being asked to kind of do more social work functions and to help families and communities, to support families and communities. So that is a big message behind our school justice partnerships and what we're here to talk to you about today. And research can connect schools and courts in three very specific ways. We know that kids who feel connected to their schools or connected to education are less likely to be involved in delinquent activity. We know that kids who experience exclusionary discipline, like out of school or out of class suspension, are more likely to commit delinquent behaviors. And we also know that individuals who graduate from school are less likely to be involved in the criminal justice system. So there are a lot of really important reasons why schools and courts should work together. And so when we talk about school justice partnership, we're talking about a formal agreement between schools and courts on how they will interface, how and when they will refer kids to us, and how the court can help support the kids that are not referred to us. The goals of school justice partnerships are reducing negative outcomes like exclusionary discipline and referrals to court, but also enhancing collaboration and supporting students' behavioral and academic success. And there are a lot of examples of school justice partnerships and models for school justice partnerships. So some of you may have heard of Judge Stephen Teskey from Clayton County, Georgia, who's really made school justice partnerships very famous. He has a judicially led school justice partnership, but there are also examples of schools that have kind of taken the lead and implemented restorative justice programs throughout their entire school. In Philadelphia, they have a law enforcement-led school justice partnership where the law enforcement officers are in charge of deciding who gets referred and what to do if they aren't referred. And finally, and another model I want to put out there is in Connecticut, it's based around mental health diversion. So there are a lot of different models, and there's a lot of information about these models available to you. So I encourage you to look on the slides. These are all links to resources that are available online. We're not going to get into the specifics around how to build a school justice partnership. We're more going to focus on the lessons that we've learned through building school justice partnerships. I have helped Allegheny County with some of their school justice partnerships that Marsha will talk about. And in addition, I've worked with many jurisdictions across the country as they build them. With that, I'm going to pass it on to Marsha with our first 6 lessons.
Hi, everybody. So just a brief personal note before I start. Before my court administration work, I used to represent kids in delinquency and dependency proceedings. But before that, I was a high school English teacher in Pittsburgh Public Schools. And it was amazing to me to be in a courtroom defending kids on charges that in the past, as a teacher, I saw handled by a vice principal. Then I became aware of school justice partnerships, and it was reassuring to know that people who had seen the same things I was seeing and had the same views had actually done the hard work to develop a framework that could be used to start changing that status quo that had been in place far too long. And I'll say this, I understood why the schools were taking the approach that they did. As a teacher, one of my happiest days was when they said, we have something called an alternative school. And I thought, happy day, all those kids who are completely uncontrollable will now be somewhere else, giving no thought to the more complex issues that were involved in that situation and the consequences of it. And that was many years ago, but unfortunately it hasn't changed as much as we all would hope that it had. So, to move on, classrooms or courtrooms? That seems like an obvious choice. The assumption is that unless you're talking about serious school crime, you're actually going to choose classrooms for addressing behavior issues rather than courtrooms. But we know that's not a valid assumption. Schools often choose courtrooms over classrooms to address disruptive behavior. And the behavior in question is low-level offense, not serious school crime. So we wanted to understand what was happening that led the schools to that approach. What we saw in our interactions with the schools is that they often believed that a kid who was going to court was going to face serious consequences, the kind of consequences that the schools themselves could not provide. This was like going to the hardware for a loaf of bread, because we know that low-level offenses often are addressed by informal adjustments or offering a consent decree. So the hoped-for heavy sanction wasn't provided by sending a kid to court, but now that kid had an arrest record with the collateral consequences that go with arrest records. And the schools very often just weren't aware of those consequences. So one of the things that we focused on was helping the schools to understand that there were consequences for sending kids to court for disruptive behavior, that was in the category of minor infractions or low-level offenses. We knew that normal adolescent development issues and unmet behavioral health needs were often behind the behavior in question. But we needed to help the schools understand that the delinquency system wasn't the arena to address those issues. So when we talk about creating a tipping point, we looked at the 3 different entities that might be able to actually step forward and do something to create a tipping point. It was pretty clear to us that the schools would be the least incentivized to change the status quo. People from the court system in recent years had the benefit of being educated on collateral consequences. And that knowledge was a major factor in driving this change effort. Community action groups had also become focused on school arrests, and not just the impact on life outcomes for the youth in question, but also for the disproportionate minority contact that was part of the school arrest picture. But the schools weren't involved in the process of gaining that kind of insight and information. In fact, for the schools, for the most part, they were viewing school justice partnerships as a way of depriving them of having an important tool to address disruptive behavior. Now, in our county, we were lucky enough to have an infrastructure in place where judges and system stakeholders met on a regular basis. We have a statewide, actually, roundtable system. It was put in place by our Pennsylvania Supreme Court about 10 years ago or so, and the purpose was to have a collaboration between child welfare and the court system that would improve outcomes for kids in the dependency system. That roundtable system has now expanded, and it includes juvenile probation, behavioral health, and attorney systems, and it's basically been, in Allegheny County, our platform for building various initiatives. Before the School Justice Partnership, we had the Crossover Youth Practice Model Initiative. In my role, one of the things that was really, I think, important is Allegheny County saw the need to have a dedicated position for cross-systems work. So part of my job is to focus on cross-systems. I meet on a regular basis with juvenile probation, child welfare, education, behavioral health, attorney systems. That is just invaluable when it comes to bringing people together to talk about what we can do to improve the situations that we all want to see improve. So, setting the course. Because of this broad outreach that we had in place with system stakeholders, we had this solid platform. The only group that was needed for a school justice partnership initiative that we hadn't collaborated with before was law enforcement. And law enforcement was happy to be involved in this. They were thrilled to be able to use their resources to address serious school crime, rather than to focus on things that really weren't a good use of their time. Now, as far as the specific plan of our school justice partnership, it was very simple. Two-pronged: pre-arrest diversion and behavioral health network to address underlying causes. It's that simple. It's that simple to say. It's not that simple to pull together. But I can't stress enough the importance of having a simple explanation for what you're doing, for the framework you're using. I always keep in mind what Einstein said: if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. So, when we talk about the lessons that we learned through the process, we knew, number one, that we could take advantage of the unique role of judges in our system. They are especially well suited to inspire change and then to bring people together to make that change happen. One of the first steps of our lead judge was to address a large gathering of school superintendents. In Allegheny County, we're probably a little unique. I'm sure there are other counties around the country that have a large number of school districts, but in Allegheny County, we have 42 school districts in one county. So for our judge to talk with a gathering of the superintendents meant that that was the first step in reaching the folks who we really needed to work with, but it had to filter down from the top. Those superintendents would go back and talk with the principals and vice principals who were addressing the disruptive behavior on a day-to-day basis. That presentation by our lead judge was followed by letters to the school community and to the law enforcement entities that were working in those communities. All of that was important, but the most important thing were the face-to-face meetings with the school administrators. That's where the all-important relationship building took place. It was also important for our team to have the support of our court system. The court was committed to having our team participate in various conferences, and in fact, our team went to Georgetown and participated in the School Justice Partnership Fellows Program that was part of Georgetown's Center for Juvenile Justice Reform. We also had a team that went out to Philadelphia to visit with folks who had a school justice partnership already up and running. And that was, those were things that were part of an ongoing system of being educated in the principles and practices of school justice partnerships around the country. So, relationships are everything. In order to identify our first school partner, we relied on our Department of Human Services, who have a very vibrant data analysis system. We looked for schools where the data showed low performance in key education indicators: attendance, behavior, academic performance. We looked for schools where there was a substantial overlap in the student population and court-involved youth. We looked for schools that were already involved in our cross-system collaboration work. What we didn't specifically look for, but what we found to be a great advantage in laying the groundwork for school justice partnership, is a school leader who is dynamic and committed to change. What we saw is if you don't have a school leader who is committed to actually addressing school climate, then any school justice partnership that you have in place is just really fighting half the battle. School climate is essential to making this work. When one of our primary partners was described as being charismatic and enlightened, he said, thanks for the compliment, but this is just all about finding a new way to do business. That's a tough message to get across, especially to schools that have been working in the same way for decades. It's pretty much the top-down model. And we all know that working from the top down just isn't effective in getting people to change. Another aspect of the affiliation between schools and courts is that the schools actually let us know that it added a little weight to the message they were conveying, in the sense that they were affiliated with a court. So that wasn't something that we had thought about initially, but it was something that they pointed out as an additional benefit to being part of a school justice partnership. We also built relationships with the schools by having the school staff, the principal and or the superintendent come to the courthouse and meet with our judges, for instance, at a monthly judges meeting. Or we ask them to present at our quarterly roundtables that I referred to earlier. Our goal was to continue to reinforce the fact that we were not doing business as usual. So when we talk about selling the partnership, we knew that it would be really helpful if we could create a win-win situation. And we knew that the way to do that was to appeal to the interest of each of the entities that would be involved. So, juvenile probation. They have an interest in not having kids penetrate more deeply into the system. Schools. The schools have an interest in improving their attendance, behavior, and academic performance data. Courts have an interest in focusing on juveniles who are most in need of court supervision. But most importantly, juveniles and their parents have an interest in achieving improved life outcomes. So how do we create a sense of urgency? What's the tool that we use to sell this partnership? And one of the best tools, and Teri has referenced this, is the use of data. We use data to show that even one school arrest makes a youth less likely to graduate and more likely to be incarcerated as an adult. Data also can be used to show the negative impact of school arrest on a youth's future opportunities with regard to housing, employment, military service, college admission, and obtaining credit. But data can also show improved outcomes after a school justice partnership is in place. In our county, our first school partner reduced the referrals to the juvenile justice system by 60% in the first year. And the 2 school resource officers who were placed in that school are now reduced to 1 school resource officer. Data from other jurisdictions around the country can show that the graduation rates have increased and the disproportionate number of students of color arrested each year has been reduced. So when we talk about same team, different game, there's a convenient fact to build our school justice partnerships on. All of the entities that normally take place in a delinquency proceeding are the entities that you need for a school justice partnership. Juvenile probation, education, behavioral health, attorney systems, they're already there. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. Now, the use of a template, what we realized is that we could have the same framework presented to schools of various sizes, representing different types of populations, or serving different types of populations, but that those particular schools could adapt the framework to their own particular needs. We actually used the same template for our MOU, and each school adapted it for their use. In the first school, for instance, they went all out. They hired a site coordinator to coordinate the behavioral health aspect of the school justice partnership, as well as to oversee the implementation of the program in their school. They created a provider council to expand the behavioral health resources that were available. School 2 placed a heavy emphasis on school climate. School 3 is focused on building their program around a dedicated space for restorative practices. So very different approaches, same framework. Now, as far as maintaining the school justice partner momentum for the second prong, some schools actually have a robust behavioral health network. Others don't. But even the schools that do can benefit by being connected to resources which juvenile probation and child welfare caseworkers have knowledge of and access to. Some examples of this in our county, our child welfare system has education specialists whose only job is to help parents navigate the special education system. Our juvenile probation office has education specialists who focus on transitioning youth out of placement back into their schools. So these are some of the resources that our JPOs and caseworkers have access to that schools might not, but could benefit from knowing about. We also have in our county a truancy prevention program operated by our Department of Human Services. And we know that each community has resources that are not necessarily associated with the schools, but could be. So that's one of the things we wanted to make sure we pointed out. Look around at what's already there for you to tap into. But if I were to cite just one lesson above all, it would be the need to convince school leaders in your partnership to engage their frontline staff early and in a meaningful way. Without the teacher investment in this, it's really pretty much spinning your wheels. And we saw that because teachers needed to understand that this wasn't, as somebody described it, this school justice partnership, hug a thug. We're just gonna let kids off easy. We had a good job ahead of us, a tough job ahead of us in making sure the teachers could truly engage with this. So if you have a school leader who's not going to focus on that, I think you're going to see have a rough patch. And I think with that, I will turn it over to Teri.
Thank you, Marsha. Before we get into the remainder of our lessons, I'm just curious, Allegheny County has had a lot of opportunity to interface with schools. How many of you your courts are currently involved in a school justice partnership or building one? There's some people, okay, good. If you have any lessons or ideas that come up, please share it with us too. A lot of places I've been, the school and the court don't work together often. So there's a lot of inconsistencies or inaccurate ideas about what the roles and responsibilities of the school and the court are. And so I have noticed that there's one way that can really help open those discussions. And sometimes when the court approaches a school to start a school justice partnership, or even just to have a conversation about working together, schools can be very defensive because they feel like you're coming on their turf or telling them that they're doing something wrong. And one thing I've noticed that can help ease those conversations or start them even is data, because using data to show them this is what we're seeing, does this make sense to you, does this look right to you, what do you think this should be? That's one way to start the conversation and to open the door to data and information sharing. When this doesn't happen, there's a lot of opportunities for miscommunication and for misuse of resources and for taking up judges' time. And so one example that I use quite often is that I was in one jurisdiction where the judge adamantly, he said, I will divert every low-level offense referred to me by a court. or by a school. I will not look at it. It will immediately be diverted. And he didn't want to see them at all. Well, he had not communicated this to the school, right? And so the school did refer some kids. Maybe some were appropriate, maybe some were not. They were all diverted. And then at a community meeting, a counselor from a school saw someone who worked in the court and said, we have a child who's destroying classrooms, who's hitting teachers, who has a lot of needs, and we cannot get his family's attention. We've tried referring him to court, but nobody is helping us. What can we do? So had that court and school opened the door to some communication, there could have been an opportunity to help that family and to not waste those resources. So that's what happens when there isn't that communication, information sharing. Another jurisdiction that this has actually worked really well in is a school that just simply started counting the number of kids that were referred from the school to the court for disruptive behavior. The intake coordinator just kept hash marks on a piece of paper every time one came across her desk. All those kids were diverted. They were most of them first time referrals. They all scored low on the risk assessment, so they were all diverted. When she shared that, bless you, when she shared that with the school principal and said, you're sending us these kids, we're diverting them. They're not being really held accountable. We're not providing them services. What can we do to help you better? They were at least able to sit down and have a conversation. And the principal's like, oh, I had no idea that you weren't taking these kids on. I didn't know that that's how diversion worked. And so just sharing a simple statistic, a simple count like that can really help open that door and start to help each other understand each other's roles and responsibilities. And these bullet points represent just kind of 4 really important key pieces of information that you can collect and share if you want to start that conversation. First, number of youth referred to court for school-based offenses, which is actually more difficult in some jurisdictions to count because it's not always captured in our administrative data system, but that's a good one to pay attention to. Or the referral source or location of their arrest. Case outcome is especially important because you want to be able to communicate to the school what happened to those kids. So were they diverted? Did they get any kind of supervision? And then by demographics of youth, as Marsha mentioned, and you have likely heard before, both youth of color and youth who have special education needs are overrepresented in exclusionary discipline and referrals to court from schools. So those are 2 populations that we should be paying attention to when we're looking at these numbers. The next thing I want to touch on is perceptions and how important they are. Marsha mentioned how critical it is for frontline, for teachers and folks to be included in the school justice partnership early and in meaningful ways. And I can't stress that enough. I think we've learned from our experience how much better it works when they are engaged. Most school justice partnerships are built by superintendents and courts. And we're asking teachers and principals and school resource officers to act different. So we need to make sure that we're all kind of working in the same manner. I have done some focus groups and interviews with school staff before doing some school justice partnerships. I've asked school resource officers and school police what their jobs are, and I've had them tell me their job is to arrest kids. In some places, not all places, right? But that's an important thing to know if that is the perception and the attitude that they have in the school you're trying to work in. That's an important thing to know. I've also talked with teachers and had them reminisce in a focus group. They would reminisce about, oh, remember the days that we could just send kids out of school or send kids to suspension or in-school suspension if they were being disruptive. We have one teacher told me that they used to be able to call the police for trespassing if a kid came to school when they were suspended. So they were looking at that as like this was helping them. So those are important things for you to take into consideration as you build a school partnership. They shouldn't stop you from doing it or stop you from moving forward, but you can get 2 really key important pieces of information, right? You know the messages that people are saying to each other and the messages you have to contradict or combat, right? And you also can identify your champions that way. You should always try to look for champions and frontline workers, teachers, guidance counselors, principals. Like Marsha mentioned in one of our schools, we just have a wonderful principal who has just taken this under taking this on and is positive and he's a great role model that will then be able to leverage his success and take him to other schools to help him kind of mentor those principals. So I really encourage you to, before you start a school justice partnership, have some focus group surveys or interviews with some of the people working in those schools, just to get an idea of what the culture and what the attitudes are. And I also want to add into this the importance of building buy-in through education and coaching. There have been a lot of changes in juvenile justice over the past, 10 to 20 years. And sometimes even as court people, we aren't up on what's the current practice. So people who work in schools are definitely either uneducated or maybe not fully understanding what the role of court and the role of probation is. That's certainly something that we noticed in one of our schools when I was doing those focus groups. So what we did that we feel was really successful is we brought our assistant chief of probation and our DA into an in-service at that school. They talked to the teachers about what collateral consequences are, what happens step by step when a kid is arrested. And the probation also talked to them about how they are considering trauma and how they're doing case management in probation. Talked about how they use a risk assessment to identify what kids need to be supervised and then what services are appropriate. And the teachers really, really benefited from that. They enjoyed it, and it helped them see, that diversion, these kids are going to get diverted. How can we work together? It also helped them see, wow, probation has all these services and community partners they work with, right? How can we also share with those partners? Because I think I had the assumption walking into a school that they were already tapped into all the community's providers. But it's been my experience that most schools are not. And the court has been able to open the school's eyes to what are some available community resources. And our final lesson here is really begin with the end in mind. So have you ever been involved in a big initiative or a kickoff and you go to a big meeting, then like 6 months later, you're like, whatever happened to that? That was a great meeting, but like, what's going on? Either nothing or no one told you what's happening, right? This is really common, I think likely to happen in school justice partnerships, because once the OU is signed at the beginning, once there's an agreement in place, the court really doesn't have much of a role left. They can kind of walk back because we're hoping that the work is happening before the kid ever, right? So what we have learned and what we find is critical is thinking about how the court will continue to be involved once those decisions are made. So there's research now on implementing projects and initiatives that says it will take anywhere from 2 to 4 years to get a new program or process kind of up and running. So my suggestion is at the very beginning of a school justice partnership, make plans for how the court will remain involved for up to 3 years. So that might be regular communication, a quarterly meeting, or trading information or data at some point. Like Marsha said, in Allegheny County, they've been able to kind of tag this on to an existing committee to give updates. But I just think that's really important because leadership changes in schools, priorities change, but this should always be something that the court stays connected to. A jurisdiction where I saw this work really well, it was also a jurisdiction that had multiple school districts, and the presiding judge would meet with the superintendents quarterly, just to talk, how are things going, is there anything the court can help you with, so on. Just a quick meeting, I think it was like a half-hour meeting quarterly. And then every month there was a court staff in all the schools that they had a partnership with. And there's questions that they would be talking about was, what do you need? How are things going? How many kids are benefiting from this? What kids are we missing? What are the overrides? Or what are kids that ended up in court that shouldn't have based on our process? And what happened and how can we correct that? And they were sharing data. And that sounds like a lot of meeting, but 2 really great things came out of that partnership. And that frequent communication. One, the court was able to see that the schools were really having a hard time getting access to behavioral health evaluations. They were waiting a long time. They didn't have a lot of places to refer families to. So the court had an agency they worked with to do evaluations, mental health assessments, and they were able to make a connection there for the school, which was really helpful. They also found that one of the roles that was really needed in the school was a social worker or homeschool visitor. They did not have enough, and they needed someone to be able to go out into the schools. So this court actually had a social worker that worked in the court and who provided some of her time to help support the school. So just continuing that conversation gave the court other ways to help the schools so that they could take some of the weight off the schools and also kind of share in that partnership. So at this point, I just want to open it up if anyone has any questions, or if someone in a school justice partnership also has a lesson that they've learned that they want to share with the group.
And please make sure you use the microphone. No, I'm not. But make sure you use the microphone since we're capturing this for our audience online. Thank you.
Sure, please.
And I don't know if you addressed this, but I'm just curious, you're addressing obviously issues with kids who are experiencing some at-risk situation that causes them to potentially have some criminal justice consequences and that sort of thing. Have you ever done anything in terms of reaching out to all of the kids in general, like developing curriculum modules or something like that to address everyone, so that, you know, if you were to create, for instance, a dispute resolution module or something like that, which would benefit everyone and not necessarily only reach out to the kids who are at risk. Have you done that? Or?
So I personally haven't done it, but I can speak to some schools that have done that. So there's been a lot of communication in the districts I've worked in about how they can incorporate some things with collateral consequences into their civics curriculum. None of the schools I've worked with have made it that far, but conflict resolution and restorative practices are certainly something that that a lot of schools are increasingly trying to use. The one school that Marsha talked about, School 3, who has a dedicated room for restorative practices, has recently purchased a online kind of conflict resolution, social skills, restorative justice practice, I guess, online class or curriculum that they'll be using for kids in school as well as the kids that are homes that are schooled online. But in terms of like a conflict resolution or a youth court, I have not worked with that in this area.
And I would actually say, hearing Teri refer to restorative practices reminded me that our major district in Allegheny County, Pittsburgh Public Schools, spent 2 years building a restorative practices initiative, and we don't communicate with them on that as much as we did initially, but they were actually funded by a number of corporations, and it was intended to be piloted in a small number of schools, but eventually to go community-wide. So I think restorative practices is one of the ways to address the needs of all students, not just kids who are at risk of referral to juvenile justice.
I mean, with that, I want to add just one more thing too. There's a program called Early Warning Systems that some communities, I know, like I believe Ohio actually has legislation around schools implementing this early warning system, which is a way to look at existing administrative data on attendance, behavior, and grades, and identify kids on a scale from like warning to like kind of red flag. And that information, those kids are considered kind of at risk of not graduating. And they use it all the way back into middle school. And so the court, in the one county there that I've worked with, the court sits in on some of those meetings where they look at the kids who are in the red, but then also the sliding kids to see what kind of services can we help put in. So that's a way of looking at the whole population, but kind of targeting what you're doing there.
I'm with Nashville, Davidson County. I have a couple of quick questions. One is, where can we find the data showing the correlation between school-based arrests and future delinquency? Do you all have
Yeah. So back on the second slide, I think your slides are on the app. Can we go back to the slide that has the links of, do you have the first? Oh, I have it way down here. I apologize. This slide that has the links, there are a couple great links that have a lot of good information, kind of background and foundational information. So NCJ, FCJ has a whole website focused on school justice partnerships, and there's a library there that has data, research, policy, several different examples. And then, so I would say that, and then the third one down, Breaking School Rules, that's one of my favorite pieces of research, and that's out of Texas, and it talks a lot about the link between exclusionary discipline and future court involvement. So I think those, the first and the third link, are probably your best bets.
Then my second question is, we have seen in Nashville a lot of times elementary youth who are having behavioral problems associated with trauma are treated behaviorally and with resources and trying to keep them in school and increasingly in a non-exclusionary manner. However, when the kids get to middle school, there's a complete disregard of even sometimes their IEP status and other things, and there's a real push to get them to the alternative school, which is an exclusionary practice and expulsion. And then they disconnect. They end up disconnecting from school altogether a lot of the time. So do you find that middle school is the best time to engage in a pilot partnership with would you do it with middle school, I guess, starting out?
Yeah, I was in a number of the conversations we had with schools before we actually partnered with any particular school. The focus on middle school was primary. So I think what you're talking about also implicates allocation of resources. So in our systems, we know the earlier you get involved, the better the results are. But that middle school phase is just so critical, and I think it bears some scrutiny as to whether we're putting the appropriate amount of resources on that phase.
Thank you.
I want to add one thing too to what Marsha said, is that alternative schools are not out of the realm of possibility for school justice partnerships either. So I've worked in one school, alternative school, it was a middle school to high school that was for court involved. Most of the kids there were court involved, but they have implemented a lot of restorative justice practices, circling, mediation. They do a lot of restorative justice in that school, and it's very focused. And then there's another school that we've worked in that is also for kids who need social and emotional support. And there's a huge focus on improving school climate and being responsive to trauma. So I think that there's a real opportunity for courts to think about how they partner with alternative schools, because it's been my experience that sometimes kids go to alternative school and like it there so much they don't want to go back. Right? And so then it's like, do you leave them somewhere, or do you try to get them back? And it's really about finding what's the best fit where that kid is going to be academically and behaviorally successful. But I think that there's some unique thinkers and some flexibility when you're working with an alternative school, and an opportunity to make some change there too. Anyone else? Okay. Well, we wanted to we're hoping that we have inspired you to reach out to your school or continue the work if you're already doing it. If you are not already involved in the school partnership, we've kind of synthesized what we think the most important 4 steps are to get started. And those are, number 1, look at data from your court. That is absolutely critical, because you want to make sure that you know how many kids are being referred to court from school. And as I mentioned, that number might not always be useful. It might take some time looking at cases, but it's really critical that you have that information. Number 2, identify your judicial champion, which is key for us in Allegheny, absolutely. But I think that there needs to be a judge, judicial leadership to move this forward. Building a multidisciplinary team. Marsha talked about how we have a multidisciplinary team in Allegheny. One thing I did want to mention that may come up in your jurisdictions is we did have an experience of juvenile probation saying, we're not quite sure why we're at the table because they don't come to probation. Like, you're trying to stop them even coming to court. But I want to say that probation has such valuable expertise in helping to identify what services are appropriate for kids, and helping to identify what services are in the community. So they can be a real, like, content experts in this area, and really important for us to have around. And then finally, start building relationships with targeted schools and school districts. If you have more than one school district, as Allegheny does, it's important that we kind of narrow that down to what are our pressure points, or the schools that are coming to our door most often. Marsha also has examples of the MOU and the letter that will be put up on the app with the slides as well, so you can access those examples. And that's all we have for you today. So, thank you.
Okay, so once again, let's give Teri and Marsha a round of applause. Don't forget, in the app, there is a survey where you can rate this workshop as well as the speakers. Please take a moment now, since we do have a little time, to go ahead and do that so that NACM is aware of what we want to see again and who we want to see again. Thank you all so much.